Good evening, and welcome to tonight's program. I'm Ellen Dunlap, President of the American Antiquarian Society, and I'm honored to be your host on this occasion, the 2020 Barron Lecture, now in its 15th year. Despite my appearances on screen, I'm speaking with you tonight from my home, which, like the actual Antiquarian Hall, which is depicted here, is built upon the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc people. We recognize that the Nipmuc and other Algonquin tribes in Massachusetts are the original stewards of this land and that they are still here. My colleagues, Jim Moran and Kayla Hopper, are co-hosting with me tonight. And now I want to call on Kayla to run down a few logistical details of the event. Kayla?
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm just going to give you a few notes about how we'll be using the Zoom webinar functions tonight, especially at the end for the Q&A portion of the program. So for that part, we'll be using the dedicated Q&A function, not the chat box. By using the Q&A function, we'll better be able to keep track of questions. It also has an upvote function. So if someone posts a question that you want to see discussed, be sure to upvote it to help get it to the top of the queue. You can place your questions into the Q&A function at any point during the program, and we'll be sure to get to them at the end. Due to the large number of attendees tonight, the chat box will only be used for informational purposes. Throughout the program, I'll be posting relevant links and information there, and you can contact us as presenters if there's any technical difficulty we should know about. You just won't be able to talk to each other, essentially. If you would like to save the chat to retain the links that I put in there for future use, you can save a transcription by clicking on the 3 dots in the chat window. We're also pleased to be collaborating with Tidepool Bookshop, which is a local independent bookstore in Worcester, to sell copies of William Cooper's Town. I'll be placing a link to order the book through Tidepool in the chat as well. And finally, just a note that we're recording this program and it will be available on our website and on our YouTube channel for viewing later. And that's all. Give it back to you, Ellen.
Thanks, Kayla. I'm next going to invite my esteemed friend, Bob Barron, to turn on his video. And this lecture series was established in Bob's honor as he concluded a decade of service to the Society from 1993 to 2003 as our chairman of the governing council. And while we've asked him to speak about the lecture series, I know he'll be too modest to speak about himself, so let me do so. Bob started his career as an engineer, excelled as a tech entrepreneur, pivoted to become an author-centered publisher, became an author himself, and has devoted most of recent decades to traveling the globe, largely in the cause of wilderness preservation. Throughout his tenure as AAS chairman, at every turn, Bob urged us to be more outwardly directed. And now this pandemic has given us a new platform to do so. Bob, let me give the platform over to you.
Thank you, Ellen. It's a pleasure to be with old friends, even if not in person. In 2003, when I retired as chair of the American Antiquarian Society, they established this lecture in my name. I was overwhelmed then, and I'm overwhelmed every year. I want to thank everybody who runs these programs. Although travel obligations preclude me getting back to Worcester often, I do follow the lectures. If I don't already have the book in my library, I put it on my Christmas list. So I've been able to read all 15 of these wonderful books. Tonight's talk by Alan Taylor will be introduced by Ellen. I will not say anything except to say it's a great book by a very special historian. Instead, I would like to say a few words about Ellen. I was fortunate to be on the search committee in 1992, led by Hal Miller and Jill Conway. It was the best committee I've ever been on. Part of the fun was for each of us to talk about AAS and where we would like it to go. We read many resumes and interviewed dozens of applicants. Trying to know somebody from a few words on paper can be misleading. It's the interview process and the discussions that increase our understanding. Ellen had a great interview, In time, we unanimously decided to offer her the job. Succeeding Marcus could be daunting, but Ellen did it beautifully. For 10 years, I was chair and worked closely with Ellen. She was a special leader, listening and motivating her staff, providing material to the council, being part of the writing of a long-range plan for AAS, reaching out to people in Worcester and around Massachusetts and New England and around the country. We had semi-annual meetings around the country from San Francisco to Denver to New Orleans and then to London. This gave us an opportunity to show off AAS as well as to get to know one another better over a long weekend. After I moved on to work on Western and international conservation and producing books and film, I followed the progress of AAS from a distance. Ellen did more outreach to the community, to scholars in the nation. As members of the staff retired, she selected and trained their successors, continued to build our collection, led the transition to the digital world, and even managed a second building program. In my 60 years in business and working with nonprofits, I've been involved in hiring many people. There's no hire I've been prouder of than selecting and working with Ellen Dunlap. She now deserves time with her family and perhaps some traveling. I'm very excited about Scott Casper following in Ellen's and Marcus's footsteps and providing his leadership. If I might, I would like to say a few words about the future. 2020 has been a very challenging year with the coronavirus, a very significant unemployment, a badly divided country, poor, I would say almost impossible national leadership, peaceful protests, and violence in the streets. A little less than 6 years from now, on July 4th, 2026, America will celebrate our 250th birthday and the 200th anniversary of the death of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. That date should not be ignored. There are many discussions underway on the question of what is America? Who are we Americans and what unites us? How do we get where we are? What stories remain to be told in Black history, Native American history, and especially women's history? How should this story be presented? In books, films, seminars, podcasts, special material for schools and young people? I don't know how this project will develop, since most of the conversations are right now in sort of the brainstorming phase with lots of people around the country. I do know that the treasures at the American Antiquarian Society will be important in describing our history, who we are, and what unites us. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much for those kind words. It's been a great pleasure for me to work with you as well. Before I introduce Alan Taylor, let me just say a word about the American Antiquarian Society, a national research library devoted to understanding and sharing the history and culture of this nation before the 20th century. While our reading room is not open to the general public during this pandemic, our dedicated staff are busy as ever in acquiring, cataloging, digitizing, and conserving the collections, supporting the work of our long-term research fellows, and presenting online exhibitions, conferences, webinars, and talks. I encourage you to explore our website, to view our past offerings, to sign up for future events, and if you can, to make a financial contribution to support our work. We are grateful for all gifts, especially in these challenging times. As Bob explained, the concept of the Barron Lecture is to ask a noted historian to reflect upon a book he or she has written that was awarded a major prize. And in Alan Taylor, who I invite to turn on his screen now, we have one of the preeminent historians of early America today. Over the course of his distinguished teaching career, first at Boston University and then at UC Davis, and since 2014 as the Thomas Jefferson Foundation Chair in History at the University of Virginia, Professor Taylor has published 10 books and been awarded prizes by the American Historical Association, the Organization of American Historians, the Society of Cincinnati, and twice by the Society for Historians in the Early American Republic. He won the prestigious Bancroft Prize for History, was a finalist for the National Book Award and the George Washington Prize, and has two Pulitzer Prizes, including one for William Cooper's Town, about which he will be speaking tonight. In 1989, Alan was awarded a long-term NEH fellowship at AAS, and he spent the 2000-2001 academic year in Worcester as our Mellon Distinguished Scholar in Residence. He's been a frequent visitor to the Society over the years, both as a reader and a speaker, and it's with great pleasure that I extend a virtual welcome to him now. Alan, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Ellen, for that very kind introduction. And I also want to thank Kayla Hopper and Jim Moran for all they've done in preparing for this. I'm grateful for Bob Barron for his leadership and for his role in sustaining this lecture. And I'm grateful to Ellen Dunlap and want to congratulate her on completing a very successful run as president of the AAS, which has been quite transformative. And I want to thank all of you who support the Society. As Ellen indicated, I've been an enormous beneficiary. I've probably spent certainly hundreds of hours in the reading room there, and some of my happiest hours have been spent at the Society. It's been a great opportunity to exchange ideas with other scholars because it's been a wonderful community to be part of. And so I want to talk about William Cooper's Town. It's a book that this is now the 25th anniversary of the book. So that's a little bit sobering because it doesn't seem all that long ago that I was researching it in the reading room at the AAS. And the origins of the book actually goes back even further to when I had a postdoc at the Institute for Early American History, now the Omohundro Institute, affiliated with the College of William and Mary. And a feature of that postdoc was that I would teach one course a year. And they wanted it to be a smaller seminar, and they wanted it to be something that had a little bit jazzier than your usual history course. So I had developed an interest in narrative history. I'd grown up reading Samuel Eliot Morison and Francis Parkman. I was an odd child. And I really was intrigued by the overlap of historical fiction and then the techniques of narrative history. And I wanted very much in my career to write things that were accessible and that used the techniques of the great narrative historians. So I thought, how about a course on narrative history and historical fiction? But then I had to figure out what was I going to assign. I had the good fortune to talk to one of my mentors and good friends, Robert Gross. And he said, well, if you're going to teach a course like that, you have to teach The Pioneers, a novel by James Fenimore Cooper. Now, that rang some bells with me, because not that I had actually read the book, but I'd read the comic book as a child. The classics illustrated The Pioneers, and I greatly enjoyed it. But it occurred to me that maybe this wasn't a sufficient knowledge of the novel and that I needed to go and read it, which I did, and that I also needed to read some literary criticism. And when I got into the literary criticism, it was highly historicist. It was very much about how James Fenimore Cooper had drawn upon the memories of his childhood in Cooperstown during the 1790s to craft this novel. And that several of the key characters were very thinly laid over historical models. And in particular, the central character of Judge Marmaduke Temple, the founder of the fictional town of Templeton, which is very much Cooperstown of the 1790s. And in this painting by Tompkins Madison, who was himself a resident of the county that includes Cooperstown, we see a representation of Judge Marmaduke Temple. He is the well-fed man who is in the green coat with the black hat. And he is escorting his daughter, Elizabeth, who is another leading character in the novel. And it's evident that Elizabeth, who's quite a saintly character, who is the paragon of femininity in the view of James Fenimore Cooper and readers of the 19th century, that Elizabeth Cooper is very much modeled on James Fenimore Cooper's sister, Hannah, who died in a tragic riding accident in the year 1800. Now, this painting shows one of the scenes from the novel, The Pioneers. We have Marmaduke Temple there escorting Elizabeth. And then we have on the right, the great character introduced in this novel. This is the first of the so-called leather stocking tales that introduces Natty Bumppo, or the leather stocking, who is one of the great original characters in American literature. Now, I was intrigued by the possibilities of doing a book that would combine attention to the novel, The Pioneers, with history. And I'm especially intrigued because I knew a little bit about William Cooper, James Fenimore Cooper's father, and the model for Judge Marmaduke Temple in the novel. This is a portrait by Gilbert Stuart. And you may note that William Cooper is holding in his hands a map, and it is a map of Cooperstown. So William Cooper is conveying to you, the viewer, that his greatest pride is the founding of this village, which he founds in the middle of the 1780s, shortly after he acquired the land there. And William Cooper has an extraordinary backstory in that he was not born into wealth. He is born into a Quaker family in Burlington, New Jersey. He was originally a wheelwright, somebody who makes wheels and wagons. And so that's hard work, and it's not usually the path to riches. But he exploited the turmoil associated with the American Revolution, turmoil that he was not a direct participant in. As a Quaker, he's on the outside looking in. He's not active in support of this somewhat violent episode. But he sees an opportunity to become a land speculator by acquiring a distressed asset, which is in central New York and had belonged to a loyalist family. And he's able at an auction of it to maneuver in a way with the help of his lawyer. And he obtains thousands of acres of land. And on this property, he will found the village of Cooperstown. And he will become, for a time, a very wealthy man. And then he will become a congressman. And he will associate with the Federalist Party, which was the more conservative of the two parties. It's the party of Alexander Hamilton and of George Washington. And it's a party that is looking to try to end what it sees as the chaos of the period of the American Revolution, to introduce greater social stability. And for William Cooper, who is himself a creature of the social mobility generated by the chaos of the revolution, he then wants to consolidate his position and try to stop further upheaval in American society, to try to slow social mobility by people coming up behind him so that he can enjoy the benefits of this secure social position. So in a way, he's trying to bring a premature end to the social changes brought in by the American Revolution. And so I thought it would be very interesting to try to understand William Cooper and to understand the world of Cooperstown in the 1790s and what it was that James Fenimore Cooper was attempting to do in this novel, The Pioneers. But I had a problem, which is, as a historian, you'd like to have a lot of primary sources. And ideally, you'd like to have a core collection of papers that formerly belonged to William Cooper. The good news was that such a collection existed. The bad news for me at the time was that it was in private hands and of descendants of William Cooper and James Fenimore Cooper. And they were discouraging of historians working with them. And I knew of at least two prominent historians, Alfred Young and Bernard Balin, who had been interested in a project involving William Cooper and both had been told no. But I thought it was worth a try, and I obtained the phone number and address for a man named Paul Fenimore Cooper, Jr., who I was told had control of these papers. And he lived outside of Cooperstown. I wrote to him and indicated what I would like to do and asked if it would be possible for me to come visit. And I did not receive a reply. I was going to Cooperstown in any case to do research in a local library there. And once I arrived there, I called up Paul Cooper, or who was known as Nicky to his friends, it turns out, and introduced myself on the phone. And he said, well, why don't you come over? Gave me directions. This was long before smartphones. And I went over to his home, which was in the countryside just outside Cooperstown. And he invited me to sit on his porch. He lived there with his mother. And she prepared cucumber sandwiches for us and had a very nice lunch. And I was trying to lead the conversation toward how valuable it would be to me if I could look at the papers and draw upon them for my research. And he kept shifting the conversation to what I might find in other archives. And finally, I said something about that I was especially interested in William Cooper's political career. And Nicky brightened and he said, political career? I'm not that interested in his political career. Come on in, I'll show you the papers. And we were sitting on this detached building and we went inside it and he opened a door that looked like a closet door, but it opened to a stair that went down into a cellar. So I walked down into the cellar and there was a whole office down there. And just off to the side of the office, there was a walk-in bank vault. And the door was open and he led me in. And on one side of this bank vault were, in these acid-free boxes, all of these William Cooper papers. I'm guessing there were probably about 40 boxes. And then on the right side were the James Fenimore Cooper papers. Not quite as numerous, but still plenty numerous. And this was like a historian's dream come true, to have open sesame and to walk into a bank vault and there is these two wonderful collections. I should say that the James Fenimore Cooper papers are now at the American Antiquarian Society, and I would later be able to work with them there. But when I started the project, they were in this bank vault. And Nicky cleared off a desk, and which is an old 19th century desk, and he said, help yourself. And I was staying in a campground, but I would come every day and work as long as Nicky would let me, and was just getting started on the collection. In the course of it, it became clear that one of the things that had opened the door for me was that Nicky was was very much a loner, but he was somebody who wanted to talk about what he was finding in these papers. And he felt he had nobody to talk to. So he would come and ask me questions over the course of the week that I was there, and I would answer them. And he and his mother became very friendly, invited me to stay for dinner. In the course of the dinner, he said to me, well, you're not the first historian that's wanted to see these things. And I said, no, I understood that I wasn't. And he said, well, I like the fact that you actually came out here and contacted me directly rather than just through the mail or by phone. And I also realized later that part of the reason why they'd been standoffish, and this had gone back to Nicky's father, who had control of the papers and was trying to write a biography of William Cooper and had fallen short, published a couple of short essays, but never published the book. And then he had charged Nicky with writing a biography. Well, Nicky had many talents. He was an Arctic explorer. He'd formerly been a physicist, had been on the faculty at MIT, but he didn't enjoy writing. And I later saw at the American Antiquarian Society his early drafts of his biography of William Cooper, which had never really gotten beyond about page 11. He had told me that he was interested at that point in writing just an essay about William Cooper's maple sugar operation. And so initially he said, I just don't want you to write about the maple sugar. You write about anything else. And I said, okay. And it became clear that this was like a 2-generation writer's block that had been a burden for his father and had been for Nicky. And I think he just had reached a point where he knew he wasn't going to write this biography. And that was the prime reason why I just came along at the right time whereas if I'd come a few years earlier, the answer would have been no. He also referred me to his cousin, Henry S.F. Cooper, Jr., who was a longtime writer for the New Yorker magazine. And Nikki said to me, "You need to meet Henry, but Henry's a romantic." So Nikki kind of prided himself on knowing William Cooper had some warts in his personality. And he said, "Go meet Henry, but Henry's going to give you the romantic view of William Cooper." And I think Henry was a great enthusiast for William Cooper. And Henry didn't have the manuscript collection that Nikki had, but what he had were objects that had descended in the family, including a celebrated chair that William Cooper's wife, Elizabeth Fenimore Cooper, allegedly had sat down in Burlington, New Jersey, and refused to move to Cooperstown, which was on the raw frontier. So allegedly, William Cooper, a powerful built man, picked up the chair with his wife in it and put it on a wagon and hauled her on up to Cooperstown. This is something that's remembered in Cooperstown ever since. And I later learned there's something called an Elizabeth Fenimore Cooper Society, which consists of people who have moved to Cooperstown because their spouse obliged them to move there. A lot of them are people who are the spouses of doctors at the hospital. But Henry also had this old organ, which had gone back to the 1797, from Philadelphia, that the family had acquired. And it's mentioned in the papers of James Fenimore Cooper about what a sensation this organ had when it's first introduced, because people of the village would just listen outside the windows of the family mansion, Otsego Hall, to listen to this, because there was nothing like this. And this particular organ, he showed me the rolls for it. It was like a player piano, but each song, each tune had a big roll that looked like a small log with staples in it. And you put it in, you turn the crank, and it would play a tune, a pretty tinny tune, but it was a tune nonetheless. And so the greatest hits of the 1790s, he had about 16 of these rolls. And he had fixed up the organ. This is Henry had fixed it up. And he then had a tape recording, and he gave me a recording of all these songs. So that when I came to write William Cooper's Town, I had a soundtrack in the background playing a lot of the time, just to kind of put me in the mood of figuring out what it was like to be in Cooperstown in the 1790s. Let me then just say what I was, that in 1988, it's July of 1988, when I met Nikki Cooper and had this week, this extraordinary experience of encountering the papers and then also meeting Henry Cooper. That December, unfortunately, Nikki died. And this cast into uncertainty what would happen with the papers. His will was quite clear, that he wanted the papers of James Fenimore Cooper to go to the American Antiquarian Society. And he wanted the papers of William Cooper to go to Hartwick College in nearby Oneonta, New York. But there was a 2-year period when the estate was in probate and these papers were in limbo. Once that ended, then I did have access and went to Hartwick College and was able to develop this project and to write about everything, including maple sugar. One of the things I found out in the course of this research was that young James Fenimore Cooper very much admired the man here, a man named Moss Kent. He's the brother of the more famous chancellor of the Court of Equity in New York, James Kent. Moss Kent was an ambitious young lawyer in Cooperstown. He lives in Otsego Hall for a while James Fenimore Cooper is a young boy. And when he was a boy, James Fenimore Cooper did not have the middle name of Fenimore. He later added that. He had no middle name, but he started signing himself James K. Cooper, James Kent Cooper, because of his admiration for Moss Kent. It's especially interesting because Moss Kent has a falling out with Judge Cooper and politically challenges him in ways that help to accelerate William Cooper's political downfall. But James Fenimore Cooper retained his admiration for Moss Kent, who for a while was it seemed to be on the verge of becoming engaged to the Hannah Cooper. And Moss Cooper would end up never marrying apparently because he just could not get over his grief for Hannah Cooper. And Moss Kent serves as the model, I argue, for Oliver Edwards, a central character in The Pioneers, who will inherit the wealth of Judge Cooper and who will marry Elizabeth Cooper, and they will live happily ever after. I mean, Elizabeth Temple. So there's a way in which the novel is wish fulfillment of a story that James Fenimore Cooper wished had happened instead of the actual history that James Fenimore Cooper, Hannah Cooper, William Cooper, and Moss Kent all lived. This is Elizabeth Fenimore Cooper, who was James Fenimore Cooper's mother. You can see her all bundled up, and it's odd to see in the background all of these small trees inside the house. She was a great gardener. That's one of the reasons why they're there. And it's also understood that this painting was made in 1816, the famous year without a summer. In the background, you see Joseph Stewart, who was the longtime family butler, who had started out as a family slave because slavery had been completely legal in New Jersey and then New York in these early years. He does obtain his freedom, but he continues to work for the family now for wages later in life. Let me just say a bit about what I was trying to do in the book. And what you're seeing here is one of my favorite 19th century paintings. It's an illustration of a scene from the novel The Pioneers. It's done by a painter, John Quidor, who is quite an eccentric painter in his style for the time, but he didn't have that much commercial success in the 19th century because he's just not fitting in with the very realistic style that prevailed. And so his landscapes have this very surreal quality. The characters are posed in ways which are very theatrical. There are ways in which they look to be characters in a dream. As a consequence, Quidor was rediscovered in the 20th century, and there's been much greater appreciation, but a lot of his art got lost. A fair amount of the paintings that he produced illustrate stories by Washington Irving, but there are a couple that illustrate the pioneers, and one of them here is the panther scene. So you have the leather stocking in the upper right hand. You have Elizabeth Fenimore Cooper and her good friend swooning in the middle, and then a panther who was threatening their lives is dying on the left, shot by the leather stocking. This is another painting, another scene from the novel, which shows the leather stocking confronting the law. The gentleman who's fallen down in the foreground, and then another one in the background. They were trying to serve a writ to arrest the leather stocking for shooting a deer out of season. And the leather stocking drives them off. And then there's this scene, which is not necessarily specific to the pioneers, but one of the characters in it, Jotham Riddle, was a money seeker, somebody who used magical techniques to look for buried treasure. And this is a Quidor painting showing that phenomenon. This is from 1832. But this is the painting that I want to spend a little bit of time on. And this is by Tompkins Madison, who is the same person who produced that painting of the turkey shoot. Tompkins Madison is from Otsego County. Here's a painting from 1850 called A Backwoods Justice Holding Court. The man in the leather apron, leaning back in his chair, is the justice. It's also evident that he's a shoemaker. And in the foreground on the floor, you can see the tools of his trade. So he has put these aside to assume his role as a justice of the peace. The man flamboyantly gesturing with his hand is the lawyer on behalf of the plaintiff, who has the red bandana and he's just beneath the lawyer's hand. He's apparently been assaulted. And the man who's accused of the assault is on the far left, being consoled by a woman. This is a painting that's conveying the ways in which American society has been democratized in the wake of the American Revolution, so that authority has been dispersed among the middle class, so that you will have the phenomena of a man who is a shoemaker being a justice. And this is very much in keeping with what I found in writing William Cooper's Town. I tell a story of William Cooper enjoying social mobility in the Revolution, and then becoming a Federalist and trying to halt the further unfolding of social mobility in America. But he is challenged within his county, challenged on the right by people like Moss Kent, who are extreme Federalists and who were so proud of their superior educations and their superior manners that they looked down on William Cooper as a bumpkin who did not deserve the wealth he had. Their challenge divides the Federalists in Cooperstown in similar ways to how the Federalists were divided around the country between wings of the party. And it opens up an opportunity on the left for populists to challenge Cooper. And ultimately, the populists will prevail in the form of a man named Jedediah Peck. I don't have any portrait of Jedediah Peck. I don't know that one survives. But this justice in the backwoods is very much in the Peck tradition. So William Cooper he has Peck arrested under the Sedition Act. This causes a sensation. It backfires on the Federalists and contributes to the defeat, not just of William Cooper, who decides he is not going to run for re-election to Congress anymore, but also nationally. It becomes something that helps New York swing into Thomas Jefferson's camp in the so-called Revolution of 1800. So the book tries to move from the local, from Cooperstown in Otsego County, to the national consequences of how federalism is challenged and ultimately will give way to a Democratic Republican Party of Jefferson and Madison and Jedediah Peck, and how that triumph vindicates a notion of the revolution as keeping open social mobility, particularly in politics, for people of limited education but robust ambitions. Now, it brings me back to James Fenimore Cooper and how he becomes a novelist. He did not ever intend to be a novelist. He intended to be a country gentleman. When his father died in 1810, William Cooper's will described a very great estate, which would endow for 7 children, properties that William Cooper valued at $50,000 each. So this is an immense fortune. But it's primarily in the form of land, and land in some pretty rustic places, especially in the St. Lawrence River Valley of New York. William Cooper had a notion that anything that he touched would turn to gold. It turns out when you look at his land speculating career, after his early success at Cooperstown, almost everything did not turn out well. And so James Fenimore Cooper and his heir, and his brothers and sister, all think that they've inherited great fortunes and that they can lead the life of gentlemen of leisure. But it all turns to ashes when it's determined that these assets are not sufficient to pay the debts of the various heirs or William Cooper's own debts. So foreclosures will wipe them all out. And most of them will die in part from the stress, leaving James Fenimore Cooper as the last of the Coopers, and desperate for some way to have public authority. So he has seen the public authority of uniting wealth and politics in the form of his father fail. And now he's seen inherited wealth fail in his own experience. And in desperation, he becomes a novelist. And he becomes the first novelist in America to be able to support himself from his writing. So he is a pioneer in many ways, not just in the creator of the novel, The Pioneers. Now, the Pioneers is his third novel after Precaution, his first, which doesn't do commercially very well. But his second novel, The Spy, did do well. And then The Pioneers is also a commercial success. So just to kind of start to wrap this up, I would say one of the key decisions that I made in structuring the book was to resist my initial idea that I would develop the history and then in the later part of the book turn to looking at the novel. Instead, what I ended up doing was in every chapter, I would conclude with looking at an episode of the novel that was relevant to the history I had told in that chapter. And this served then to show the ways in which the novel reflects on that history and how it does so highly selectively. The novel looks at a year in the life of Templeton. There are many fascinating vignettes of that life, including the turkey shoot or the mass slaughter of passenger pigeons. But there's also a gaping absence, which is there are no politics. There's no election. And this is a time when elections were annual. So for James Fenimore Cooper, there's kind of a loving repossession of a lost Cooperstown, but it's a lost Cooperstown that he improves by eliminating Republican politics. And the novel ends with the successful transition of power and wealth to Oliver Edwards and to Elizabeth Temple, with no suggestion that there's any insecurity in this particular estate. So unless you know the backstory of the history of this family, you don't, I think, truly appreciate what James Fenimore Cooper is trying to do, and just how much of a fantasy, and a fantasy that is one that tries to erase all sorts of pain in his family, including the downfall of his father, but especially the loss of his sister Hannah. Now, I was also then asked to reflect a bit about the influence of the book, and I don't really know that it's had much of an influence. I will amend that just a bit, in that for a while I would often hear from some younger scholars that they had read the book and they saw it as quite a different kind of history book, one which drew them right into a kind of fully realized, or it seems at least the illusion of a fully realized world in the past, which is not common in academic history books. And that they had been people who hadn't been thinking about going into academia, but they told me that they decided to go to graduate school because they read William Cooperstown. And there were probably 4 or 5 people who told me that. But I can't really think of any recent books, and maybe this is just my inattention. I don't think of any recent books that do quite what I was trying to do in William Cooperstown. So I don't think there's any kind of William Cooperstown school of doing American history. Certainly the sales of the book have flattened out in recent years. The things that it was concerned about, particularly the meaning of the American Revolution, the role of the frontier and the construction of property and power in American society, these are things that still are of interest, but I would say they're not really of central interest among my fellow early Americanists right now. So it's a book that I honestly don't know whether what kind of influence it may have in the future. It had its moment, and I think there are still people who occasionally read it. You can still find it in bookstores in Cooperstown, but I think you'd kind of be hard pressed to find it in bookstores anywhere outside of Cooperstown. So with that said, that's my notion of how I got involved in doing William Cooperstown, the key role of the American Antiquarian Society in my doing the book. It's a book that transformed my career. It certainly had that impact, thanks largely to its winning the Pulitzer Prize and the Bancroft Prize. And I'm very grateful then to the Cooper family for their help to me, to James Fenimore Cooper and William Cooper for being such fascinating people living in the past, and to the prize committees and to the readers who have encountered the book and appreciated it. So I will conclude there, and I will look forward to the questions, which I believe Ellen will draw upon and pose.
Thank you very much, Alan. I think you're very modest about the influence of the book. And I think that I hope that we send a spike in the sales from tonight's participants. The information is in the chat to let people know how to order from Tidepool Books. Also, I want to remind people that in the Q&A, there are quite a few questions coming in, and we'll take them as time permits until the closing hour. Several people, Alan, have really asked the same question, and it comes to down to this: how have changes in the years since you wrote the book in historiography or writing, changed at all how you might approach the book? Were you starting now?
If I were starting now, I would do a lot more with the presence of Native peoples in the novel, and then the presence of Native people in the Cooperstown of history. I would say that that is the greatest omission in the book. You know, obviously, a Native character of Chingachgook is quite present. It's a very stereotypical character in many ways, but still an interesting one with considerable dignity beneath the kind of stereotypical dialogue that's put in his mouth. It's also apparent from the history of the Cooper family that that Native peoples, particularly Oneidas of the Haudenosaunee, were regularly in and around Cooperstown. And so I wish I'd done more with that. I also would like to have done more with James Fenimore Cooper's daughter, Susan Fenimore Cooper, who wrote a fascinating book called Rural Hours, which I have nurtured a thought that at some point I might do a book about her and Rural Hours, a kind of sequel to William Cooperstown. Obviously, I haven't come to do that yet, but that might be in my future. So I think I could have done more with gender, and I could have done more with Native peoples, and than I did. And so those would be the two things that I would do a little bit differently.
And you found the sources would be there to have that input?
On Native peoples, yes. Now, again, it's not a matter that they would become 50 pages in the book, but I do think they could be 10 pages in the book, and the book would be better for it. In terms of Susan Fenimore Cooper, I just haven't. I've read Rural Hours. I've read literary criticism of Rural Hours, but I haven't looked at the manuscript material that much. So I don't know whether that would sustain a book. It's something that I may look into.
We've had a question taking off from your comment about your good luck in inquiring about the Cooper papers at just the right time. And it seems to parallel your conclusion about William Cooper's lucking out when he started his town. And so could you talk about good timing in history and how we understand or misread that in retrospect?
Yeah, I mean, one of the ironies is that I'm writing about a period of time that generates the centrality to American culture of individualism and the notion of economic life as a competition in which individuals prove their merit, in which success goes to those who deserve it, and the people who fail, who are poor, apparently merit that. And those are ideas that come out of the triumph of a vision of the American Revolution as empowering social mobility as the central factor in American life. And I'm not saying that there's no truth to that. I'm just saying that it often is overplayed. And I'm telling the story of this family in which they at times oversell their capacity to control events. William Cooper certainly did. And the power of an individual to impose themselves in ways that assure the success of that individual and his family. So, so this is a classic theme in a lot of American 19th century literature, is the way in which people try to control their fate and find out that it's not so easily done. William Cooperstown, I'm often just completely astonished by many strokes of luck. I didn't cover them all in my presentation. The stroke of luck of Nicky Cooper warming to me and opening up this collection. The stroke of luck of his will, putting them in Harvard College, where I became very good friends with the archivist. And it was a small operation, and this may horrify you, Ellen, but she just basically opened up the sacks and said, go on back there and help yourself to anything that you'd like, and just take it out to your desk. And of course, I went back and I looked on one of the boxes of the papers, and it had said Harvard University, and it had the name Jane Garrett on it. I said, that's interesting, because I had met Jane Garrett about a couple of years before, and at a reception for the book launch for David Hall's book, Worlds of Wonder. And I didn't really know who Jane Garrett was at that point, but she asked what I was working on. I said, I'm doing this project about the Cooper family and pioneers. And she became very interested, said, send me a book proposal. So I sent her a book proposal. She was at Knopf, an editor, and a very successful editor, it turns out, of wonderful books. And she got me a contract, the trade press, first time I'd worked with the trade press. But she was a woman of relatively few words. She was a true New Englander. She makes me look talkative. And so the next time I saw Jane, I said, Jane, very interesting. I was looking at this box of papers and it had your name on it. She said, oh yeah, I'm an old friend of Nicky Cooper's. And when he was at MIT and I was at Harvard, he asked me to help him organize the paper, so I did. So that explained why she had warmed to my topic and thought it was particularly interesting. And it opened this door at Knopf for me to get a contract. So again, there are so many ways in which I got so lucky in doing this book time and time again.
We have a question, if you have any thoughts on the relationship of William Cooper's Town to Liberty Men and Great Proprietors.
Well, Liberty Men and Great Proprietors is my first book. It's a highly political book, I would say, and it has the overlap of it's trying to understand what difference did the American Revolution make. In some ways, it's a more pessimistic book in that it looks at people who were considered squatters, who thought that the revolution had empowered them to make farms in what they saw as free land in central Maine, and they're frustrated by a legal and political system in most ways. And so I was still interested in questions of land speculation and who gets power through land speculation. And that was one of the strands that led me to William Cooper. So there is some overlap there. But it's a book in which the land speculator doesn't so clearly triumph. And the land speculator in general wasn't such a bad guy, unlike the people that the land speculators seem to have been in central Maine. So there are ways in which it builds on my previous work, but it also, I think, broadens it out. It's more attentive to cultural history as well as social history than was my first book.
There's two related questions here, and they may be our last ones. I think it's been suggested that you are being overly humble about your impact of your book. To a large degree, it reintroduced narrativity to the history of frontiers and borderlands, and this was no small feat. And one of the other questioners says that your modesty in discussing the legacy of the book spurs him to think about the recent spate of scholarly attention to immediate post-revolutionary era fascination with gentility or politeness and the redefinitions of social class identities. Would you comment on that aspect of how the work in William Cooper's Town prefigured some of those studies?
Well, I think I'm more kind of beneficiary of that work, or a fellow traveler with that work. I think a lot of that work was already, going on, and I tapped into it. I think, particularly Richard Bushman's work on the Reform of America, which was a book that was immensely influential on me. And so a lot of my interpretation of what William Cooper was trying to do and what James Fenimore Cooper hoped to replicate is very influenced by Dick Bushman's book and others. So I would say I've been in very good company and being interested in gentility, but I don't think I can take all that much credit for something that was moving forward on many different fronts and among cultural historians.
Alan, I remember when you were in Worcester, you played a lot of pool. But there's another question about another kind of ball.
And none of it was for money, I want you to know. So none of my money went into that.
It was a form of fellowship, I remember.
Yes.
At what time in your research process did you become a town ball enthusiast?
No, that's something. This was another one of the great things that I developed out of going to Cooperstown. In going to Cooperstown, I had a good friend, Paul D'Ambrosio, who's now been the longtime leader of the New York State Historical Association and the Fenimore Art Museum. Paul was doing a lot of research out there, and he said, well, you should come play town ball with us. What's town ball? Well, it turns out a guy named Tom Heights, who was the librarian at the Baseball Hall of Fame and also a historian of baseball, was trying to move the Hall of Fame off of its mythic position that baseball had been invented one day by Abner Doubleday in a field in Cooperstown, which, sorry to disappoint people, is not true. Well, Tom Heights' way of doing this subtly was to revive town ball, which was a bat and ball sport that was played in 19th century New England and New York, very popular, and pre-existed baseball, just to show that these kind of bat and ball games in rural America were pretty ubiquitous. And so I got to play town ball with Paul and Tom Heights and all these other people. And it has since become a great phenomena in that corner of New York. There are a lot of town ball teams. And so I introduced it to my graduate students at Boston University and later at UC Davis, and to a limited degree at UVA. So I've been trying to be a missionary of town ball as well as pool in my career.
I'm going to end with a comment that is a great way to cap this evening, I think. One of our participants wrote, "I don't have a question, but a point of gratitude for your crafting this book. I was teaching AP US history and frustrated by the textbook available to my students. So we shifted our plan and read this book over the first quarter. It was the best year of teaching I ever had because this book presented us with an incredible foundation for the study of all American history. Thank you." And I think that's
very kind. So thank you for those kind words.
And thank you for your presentation tonight. And thank you for being with us virtually. And we hope the day comes soon that we can welcome you back to Antiquarian Hall.
Well, I look forward to that day.
Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. And we hope to see you on a future program. Thank you.